Hello my quilting friends! Welcome to this How Do I Quilt This video. This is all about explaining quilting design and breaking down simple concepts so you can see how to design your own quilting design and get your quilt finished. And for each quilt that you post to the Quilt Friends Club, I share 3 different quilting ideas. And I try and do this based on how you want it to be used, meaning whether the quilt is going to be for show or it's going to be for bed, and also depending on what machine you're going to be using. So like in this case, Jane posted this quilt and she quilts on a long arm. This was posted by Kathy P and she quilts on a home machine. So I'm always taking these things into account. So when you share a photo to the Quilt Friends Club, make sure to include what type of machine that you quilt on and how you want this quilt to be used. If it's going to be used on a bed, on a couch, or it's going to be put on a wall, and also how much time you have to quilt it, because of course all of those decisions definitely affect how much time you're going to have to invest in the project, how much time you want to spend on it. So let's start out with this quilt. This is posted by Kathy P. And she indicated that there is definitely a time limit on this. This is what Kathy said. She said she's just got too many ideas for how to quilt it. It's going to be a couch quilt for her granddaughter in New York where it's very cold. And so my very first suggestion right off the bat is maybe consider a wool batting because that's going to be super warm, and it's also and maybe also consider a minky back, although that might slow you down a little bit. Wool battings typically are quilting up to 3 inches. So 3-inch spacing would mean that you're going to be quilting roughly, maybe about 2.5 inches. That's going to be the maximum amount of space you want to leave open. So the upside with a wool batting, Kathy, would be you get it nice and thick and dense and fluffy, and it's going to be super warm. The downside is you're going to have to do a little bit more quilting. At least that would be about as much space as you'd leave open if you used a Hobbs heirloom wool. So that's just something I'm throwing out there because that's one of my favorite wool battings. I'll just put it that way. So first idea here is some straight line quilting. This would be fairly minimal, and so I would maybe go in with some stitching in the ditch or echo ditching around these stars. And the basic idea would be just use a very long ruler and line it up. You're using those diamonds that you pieced in the quarter stones. So these diamonds right here that were they were kind of created when the blocks came together. And this is really one of those fun things that I love about piecing, is that sometimes you get these secondary designs, whether the block was this shape or the block was around the star. We have these extra little diamonds that are being created, and when you accent that, it really does look nice. And then you can go around and do some stitching in the ditch. That's going to bring out that star, but that might be a little bit on the slow side. However, I would still say this is definitely minimal quilting, and I would carry those lines out to the border. We have this nice big border, but for speed, really straight line quilting is going to be the key. Let me get a wider pen here so that way hopefully you can see what I'm doing. Speed, and Kathy indicated that she wanted to get this done and shipped within the next couple of weeks. So this is going to be something that you want to think about, just really keeping it minimal. And if you're more wedded to the speed side of it than the warmth side of it, then I would say maybe consider a different type of batting than I suggested. Instead, go with a polyester or a bonded cotton batting that allows quilting up to 8 inches or even more, 10 inches. And then you could just simply stitch these straight lines, and that would be as much quilting as the quilt needs to hold it together. You wouldn't need to go around the stars. You could just get it done, get it out. So you kind of have to think about which one you want more. Do you want it to be super warm with a wool batting, or do you want it to be done very quickly? Okay, so now let's stitch it up a notch. You got the straight lines down. Now let's just imagine if Kathy had a lot more time to play with this. What would we do instead? Well, this design idea it basically just takes a little bit more focus on the piecing and that would be to go in and quilt stippling around those stars. And that would be flattening out that background so that way it looks nice and you could wiggle through that area fairly easily on your home machine. So that would work good. You could kind of use a little escape hatch, kind of wiggle through those stars, maybe do a little bit of travel stitching to get over. And if you wanted to, you could do that, or you could change it up and do a slightly different design in these darker background areas, and that would be kind of cool. So you've got stippling, and then this is sharp stippling through here, and that would be an alternative design. Now, you want to plan your path and kind of think about this. Okay, how am I going to get from A to B, so that way you can be moving the most efficiently through it. So like right here, kind of maybe escape through this way and then go back to stippling down here. And when you're quilting on a home machine, Kathy, you're generally working from the center. That would be these two center places outward. So that way it's going to feel progressively easier. And that would definitely feel good just working from the center to the outer edges. Those center blocks are going to be the hardest to quilt and move it around because, of course, the quilt's going to be bunched up in your machine a lot. But as you get to these outer blocks, that's going to feel easier and easier. Now, you got this gorgeous wide border, and I love it. I love having this much space to play in a border. And my idea was to kind of use that stippling idea as a, just kind of echo that in the border. Just kind of bring that nice curvy line design into the border, just like this. Start with a big foundation. I call this river path when I stretch it across in a border like this. And so that sets the foundation, one big long wiggly line. If you quilted this on a home machine, I'd start in the middle and quilt down one side, then rotate the quilt and quilt to the other side. That will just simply stop it from having, too much stretch going in one direction. And then you can just simply echo it. So it's just echoing that first line to the inside. Let me continue that echo down this way. And you just have to watch out when you're quilting on a home machine and you've got a long border like this. It's really easy to start stretching, and it's a subtle thing between your hands. It's like a hand tension thing. You can start to stretch it. So just watch out for that. And I do find that it helps to just kind of, mark out, figure out where the midpoint is and stitch down one side and then the other and just keep working from the center out. And that will work really well. That will be time consuming because you've got more thread breaks here coming in the middle. So just think about that as far as, time investment, how much time you want to spend on it. And then of course, you don't need this much quilting if you choose a cotton or a polyester batting that, has a wider amount of space between the lines. You could go with something that doesn't need that much quilting, and you could just do 2 or 3 lines. You'd still get a nice curvy effect with a lot less effort. So that's an idea too. It just really depends on the type of batting that you're putting in the center. And that is a really super important choice, guys. The batting that you put in the middle of your quilt really does determine how long you're going to be messing around with it. Because, certain types of batting require a lot more quilting than others. And especially when you're quilting for speed, that's something that you gotta think about. Okay, so now let's talk about this idea. This would be, again, a little bit more time. Actually, a lot more time, because if you did this as concentric squares, then you're going to have a thread break with each one of them. I guess you could start, it looks like there's a seam allowance right there. You could pull up thread there and go around and then use that as an escape hatch and just travel stitch along that seam line. You're kind of connecting them together, but it would be hidden at least on the front because it would be buried in that seam line. So that would be a little bit of an escape hatch and would speed you up a little bit. But that would definitely be slow as far as, you're manipulating the quilt around and forming each square. And, again, how much quilting do you really need? You could get away with maybe only 2 squares in each section, and that would be plenty. And then in these other areas, I went on the diagonal like this. I think that looks really nice. Again, maybe only just 2. That looks sweet. The one thing about this design, I kind of ran with this one, and straight lines for some reason are really coming to me today, guys. So Forgive me if you're not a straight line fan, but I don't know, there's just something about it. Sometimes this happens where you'll just start drawing and everything that you do is circles, or everything you do is squares, or everything you do is spirals. You just have to honor that and say, well, that's your inspiration right now. Don't try and fight it. Don't try and judge it. I'm really liking straight lines today for some reason. So, you know, I think that this is nice, but this does detract from those stars, you know, and I'm just looking at this going, well, then that becomes the focal point, becomes really these background areas, and those stars start to recede. So you really have to just think about what you want to accent with the design. I was thinking of something kind of funky in the border, maybe some straight lines randomly, and then you'd maybe change to straight lines going this way, and then straight lines going back this way, and kind of keep it random so you'd have straight lines for a good way, and then go to something different. I thought that might be cool. You know, it's fun to get funky in borders, especially when they're this wide, because you've got so much space to play, and you can do something really creative, especially when you have a quilt where obviously some rules have been followed. You know, this is a very symmetrical arrangement. It's fun to do something really funky and different in the borders that might be just unusual for that style of quilt. One idea that I'm thinking of, this was something I did in a tutorial. It's called the checkerboard quilt. You can look it up, leahday.com/checkerboard. I did these big heart paisleys through half the border like this. And then I switched to straight line quilting, and I absolutely love the fact. It was one of the first times I ever did kind of a 2 different designs in one border. So I took those straight lines up and just ran them right against, sorry, messy, but I ran them right up against that heart shape, and it really turned out nice. So that's an idea too. You could kind of break up the straight lines and do something a little softer in the border as well. So there we go. Those are my ideas for that particular quilt. I think it's really pretty. I do think if you're aiming for speed, you're going to want to go with minimal quilting and a batting that allows you to get away with that. If you're a little bit less worried about the speed side of things, then look for a batting that's going to be nice and warm, and that will make you happy. So there we go. That is Kathy's first quilt. And Kathy also submitted a second quilt, and yes, I'm going to do this one too, but I did want to say next month we're going to only limit it to 1 per person, and so make sure whatever quilt top you submit is the one that you really want to work on in the next month, and that'll be great. So this is a postage stamp quilt that Kathy designed herself, and I think it's got some really cool, it's a cool design, and it's creating a neat secondary design. So again, I felt like straight line quilting was a good choice here. And this is just simply saying, okay, there is a lot of scrappy pieces here. What is the most minimal way that I can get away with quilting it? And when I say get away, I don't mean that in like a bad sense. I'm meaning it in a more of a minimalist sense, not in any kind of like, oh, I'm shirking my duty or anything like that. It's largely like, when you piece something and it's big and you're excited about it, I think sometimes the best choice is to get it done quickly. And please keep in mind that you can always go back later and you can add more quilting to your quilt, whether it's by machine or by hand if you want to. And that's always open to you. And I think that really the key is just to start finishing our quilts so they can be used and enjoyed. And then if you look at that and go, wow, I really wish I'd done something, you know, more funky in there, then you can always go back and do that later. But I really like this. The going down on the diagonal, I think accents. It puts an X mark right in the center of that postage stamp. It puts it right in the center of the secondary block that was created by this design. And I really like that. It's super simple. It'll be pretty fast with walking foot or with ruler foot or free motion quilting. Carry that out to the border, and I think that will look a-okay. So that's honestly my favorite. Here's another straight line design that is also really accenting that secondary design here and just running the straight lines right through the middle of those little squares. And I think this would be good too because you could probably eyeball it. You won't even need to mark it. You know, if you do mark it, use masking tape because that'll stay nice and straight and keep you on track, and then you don't have to worry about erasing the marks. So I think that would be a cool choice. Just add one more line through there. Yeah, super minimal, and it allows, you know, if you did something puffy, that would allow those postage stamps to stand out. Now you need to make sure your batting will allow for that much space to be left open. If it doesn't, you could go in there with a little square, you know, just stitch one square per block. That would be kind of cool. So keep in mind, it can be as minimal or as fancy as you like. It all depends on what your batting allows. And then this one was kind of stitching it up a notch. I really like these channels created from that secondary area. You know, it's sashing, but it's a little bit more funky than sashing. So what I was thinking is maybe go in there with just a wiggle wobble. I just call this wiggly U shapes. You're just wiggling up and down. I just thought that might make it a little interesting, and you could go straight over those squares or you could stitch around them. It's totally up to you, but I really like that. And you can see it kind of creates this woven effect when you go vertical too. And then if you want to quilt something in that piecing, maybe a spiral, either a circular spiral or a square spiral. These quilts are fairly large, and on a home machine, something like a small spiral like this is going to be a little challenging because you're going to do a lot of manipulation. If you choose like walking foot quilting, you're going to have to change direction a lot, and that'll be a lot of shifting through the machine. So my best advice would be to experiment and try it, and maybe like test it on a small sandwich, and then think about how that's going to feel when it's a lot more bulk to be shifting through the arm of the machine. I really do like the overall design of this in the woven line effect. I think that'll be really cool. But it's all down to, you know, how much quilting your quilt needs and how much time you have to quilt it in. Okay, so now we're gonna move on, and this was posted by Marcia, and she said she needs an easier or faster design because she spends way too much time quilting. She has some rulers, but they're killing her back and shoulders, especially for large quilts, and this is obviously a large quilt. So let's see what we can do here. This is a little bit on the busy side, and this was one thing that I just kind of generally picked up on with the quilts posted this month is when your fabrics are busy, there's not much of a point of going super elaborate with your quilting. And I hope no one takes that as an insulting thing. It's just simply that the focal point is your fabrics. You know, obviously these are really, really busy prints. They're really cute. That's really the design of the quilt. Your quilting is going to recede, is going to hide. In that you're not going to really see it because the prints are so busy. You know, quilting only really shines when it's on plain fabric where it can be it's not competing against anything. So in this situation, I'm going for simplicity, and I saw these diamonds here on the border of the quilt, and I thought that was kind of cool. So what if you just took those diamonds and used that as, you know, just like the baseline of the design and just ran some straight lines from those diamonds. And then I realized after drawing a few of them on here that they don't really run in line with the flying geese, which might end up being a little on the weird side, but you know, at the same time, I think that's kind of cool. You know, if it runs symmetrical, then it's going to hit, you know, roughly in the same places on both sides. So I think that could be pretty cool. And it's unusual. You know, it's taking the border design and saying the border design is the most important thing rather than the quilt top design. Usually, whenever we're, you know, working off something, it's the quilt top design that extends into the borders, not the other way around. So I really like that. I thought that was kind of a cool idea. And then, of course, you're going to need more quilting just to finish it off. Then some, you know, just really simple curving lines. You could do that with walking foot quilting. You could do that with free motion quilting. On a home machine, again, you're going to want to start in the center and stitch to one side, rotate the quilt, start in the center, stitch to the other side. That's just going to stop it from doing any kind of big shifting all the way across the quilt. And it also, it won't feel too challenging, I don't think. I do agree with Marcia about ruler foot quilting on large quilts. It's just really hard on a home machine to manage the bulk of the quilt plus the ruler. That's a lot of stuff to be pushing through the machine at once. So maybe sticking with something more minimal where you don't have to have the ruler in your hand. You know, a walking foot can do this, can manage this, and you can mark the quilt with tape instead of using a ruler. I think that'll be a lot easier on your back and shoulders. Now, I like this idea, but it might be a little bit on the weird side. So let's go with something a little bit more normal, and that was this one. And that was just basically looking at these rectangles and saying, okay, here's a space that I could play. And you can just use this as a way to learn different quilting designs. So here I could fill this one in with stippling. I could fill this one in with sharp stippling. These are all speedy designs that will flow through the area really easily, and they aren't going to be dense or intense. There is basic spiral. So that's an idea. You could use it, you know, basically each rectangle area as a challenge to learn a new design and master it, and you'll get a good bit of practice with each one, and then it will be kind of a showcase of different design ideas. Through the flying geese border, straight lines for the most minimal effect. Now, if you love those flying geese, then stitch in the ditch on every single one of them, obviously. That's a great choice too, but that's a lot of flying geese and very time consuming. So I just say straight lines right through the middle and call it done. So that's what I would do for practicing free motion quilting designs and getting some maybe walking foot straight lines with walking foot quilting. You could do some different designs in that diamond border. I really love that diamond border, by the way. That's a really, really cute design. I think that's really nice. You could do something really special out there. Now, one more funky straight line quilting design. Like I said, guys, it's just running with the straight lines this week. So this is kind of playing off of that border in a fun way. And this is a choice that you can always make on your quilts, is to say, well, I like that one thing, and I'm going to make that one thing be the whole focal point of the quilt. And so basically I just took my ruler and ran a straight line coming off that flying geese all the way over it. And of course this quilt is on the bed, so I don't have the best perspective on it. And, you know, there's an angle, basically it's coming down, but you can kind of get the gist of what this would look like if you just did straight lines off of the flying geese. And this would become an all-over quilting design, meaning that you're taking those straight lines and you're covering the entire quilt with it, and you're ignoring all other piecing. You're ignoring all other designs here. I think this is really cool. You know, when I came up with this, this is a challenge for me to just think of creative ways of quilting each one, and I saw this, I thought that is really cool. That's honestly my favorite way to quilt and deal with those flying geese borders, because it's creative, it's something different, it's making that a focal point so you're not ignoring all that piecing, because that is some seriously time-consuming piecing, and it's, you know, an all-over design, so it's going to be very simplistic. As far as the quilting goes, you can see it's asymmetrical, so you're going to have a longer line going in this direction than in this direction. You might want to split this up so that sometimes you're starting maybe on that seam line, sometimes you're starting in the middle, sometimes you're starting, you know, just kind of randomize it so you're not pulling up thread on every single flying geese, and sometimes you're working more from the center to the outside edge. I think that'll work out well. But yeah, that one, I really like that one the best. That was my favorite. And I know it seems super simple, but I think that will really accent the whole quilt. It'll give it a nice feel, a nice effect. It's obviously a bed quilt. That'll be plenty of quilting for it. So there we go. Thank you, Marcia, for sharing your quilt with me. So here is our fourth quilt, and this was posted by Jane Dornfeld. And she is a long arm quilter, so we need to think about long arm quilting with this one. And she's open to suggestions on how to quilt. This was a Starburst quilt from Missouri Star Quilt Company. So you could learn how to do this one too. Now, I gotta say, this one gave me a little bit of a struggle because it's asymmetrical, but in kind of an odd way. You've got kind of this panel, and then the colors flip for this kind of every eighth of the quilt, it splits again. So it's not really symmetrical in any normal way. And I would not have thought that that would be an issue, but I struggled a little bit to come up with a quilting design that I felt like really accented the star shape, because it just felt like the colors in me weren't getting along all that well. So this was my first idea, was to do echo ditching, and you could do this with rulers. And the other reason why I felt just a little bit of, I guess, quilter's block on this one is the amount of space that you have to quilt in on a long arm. And this is something I explained in last month's video. But basically on a long arm frame, you have a limitation of the size of your frame. So a lot of the design ideas that I had were really going to be something that could work on a home machine, you know, that would kind of come in and cover that entire area and accent, you know, each space separately. None of that could really work on a long arm. I don't know how big Jane's long arm is, but we need to make sure that we're keeping it relatively small so that way the size that we're quilting in doesn't exceed. So, you know, I'm not trying to stitch something super long where I'm going to have to break thread in order to quilt that design through the long arm. So keeping that in mind, I thought echo ditching around that diamond shape and then come inside and just travel stitch and work off that, filling the diamond shape up with some straight line quilting that kind of accents that star shape nicely. It's simple and it would be fairly speedy. Now you could use escape hatches, just kind of escape through there and escape up into the next one. And you'll have that little bit of quilting that would be visible on the front and back, but that'll save you a lot of thread breaks. So I think that would be a good choice. If I was in a big hurry, I would definitely use those escape hatches like that. Get around over here and do the same thing. Now, can you leave entire diamonds open like this? That really just depends on the rating of your batting, whatever your batting says, and however big those diamonds are. If it says that you can leave quilting up to 8 inches open and those diamonds are only 7 inches, then I think that that should be just fine. I don't think that you need to quilt anything inside of them. So that was my first idea. I thought that was pretty cool. Now this idea kind of runs off that same line of just filling in the lightest diamonds. And this is what I call lacy lattice. And so you come in, it's basically wiggly U shapes, but then you're bringing in and you're widening that out to make kind of a bubble shape and then running those so that they nest together. So you hit that line and then you hit that side and you hit that side. And it really has a cute effect through that area. I think that's nice. And it's going to quilt fairly quickly. It might end up spitting you out though in weird places. So like here I'm quilting through this area and I'm going to end up down here, which is kind of an odd spot. You know, I guess you could advance your frame and get up there, or you could travel stitch down all the way down and then start that one. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind of. And you know, the best possible thing is get on the long arm and trace your finger around it and see how much space you have to quilt in and how you're going to get from A to B, whether it's travel stitching in the ditch or echo ditching to get to the next area. Now this one I think is honestly my favorite. It's more straight line quilting. So basic idea was use your channel locks. So that is a locking mechanism on your frame that allows you to stitch nice straight lines right across. You could also just use a ruler and ruler foot. That would help you out too if you don't have channel locks. So another straight line. And that's basically just echo ditching that seam line. And I'm doing 2 lines of quilting to the top and bottom, just like so, straight across. And then the idea was just to kind of a zigzaggy line and accent the piecing with it though. So here I'm angling that line to go with the angle of the piecing, although I don't want to end up like stitching in the ditch necessarily. I want to stay out of the ditches so that way the line stays nice and visible. But then right here in the center of the quilt, I'm going to change direction. And then so kind of accent that sunburst effect and angle it this way. I thought that was kind of cool. It's very simple. It'll be very fast. This will honestly be the speediest method because you're ignoring the piecing. you're using the frame to the greatest ability, meaning edge to edge quilting, which is what a quilting frame does best. And it's accenting the piecing in a way, but not really paying attention to it closely. And it's also minimal quilting. It's not going to be quilted to death. So that one was almost honestly my favorite. I thought it was kind of cool. And this is one of those things, when you're in the mood for something in particular, kind of everything else is just not going to be as appealing. And again, don't question it. Don't argue with yourself about it. And especially, this is just kind of a thing that I struggle with. When I feel like I've designed something too simply, I am often really critical of it. Like, oh, well, that's just so simple. Sometimes simple is the best option. You know, it doesn't have to be mega complicated in order to be pretty. All right, there we go. That is it for the Sunburst quilt. And now we have a Blue Keys quilt. And this was designed by Barbara Purino, and Louise DeVault shared it. She says she wants to sell the finished quilt. And that'll be kind of interesting. So I went with minimal quilting first. Again, more straight lines. There's an issue that I'm having with this quilt, and that is it's a pretty busy background. So whatever you quilt in this background area might end up getting a little lost. It does have kind of a oriental kind of feel to me. Maybe that's just something I'm picking up on. That's, you know, just the fabrics or the shape of the piecing. I don't know why. So this felt like a nice kind of zen design, very minimalist, very simple. If you needed more quilting in it, then of course more straight lines just to accent that piecing, run right along it. I think that would be nice. And keep it simple, you know? Even a quilt that you're going to sell, I don't feel like you need to stitch it to death just to say, you know, you can sell it. It really depends on what the quilt's going to be for. Is it going to be sold as a bed quilt / throw or a wall hanging? And just think in terms of what's going to have the best effect for what it's going to be used for. And I really like this. It creates a nice grid over the surface that is symmetrical and it, you know, nice repeating pattern. I think that looks good. Now, going along with that slightly oriental theme, I thought about circles. Now, this will take a lot more time to finish. First, stitch in the ditch around that piecing design, and then start filling in that background with circles. And one thing I was trying to do is to intentionally accent and go around those big, the darkest circles in the print pattern. So there's a kind of a print that has these flowers on it, and to go around those intentionally, make those stand out. Now that definitely will be something that will take a little bit more time and thought and planning. So take that on only if you want to put that much time into it. Pebbling always takes a lot of time. And I thought about, as far as something to go inside of this cool piecing design, maybe just an internal echo. You could do that with rulers. You could do that with your walking foot. Just run the edge of your walking foot right in line with that seam line. That would be kind of cool. Yeah. So the pebbling, the bigger your circles, of course, the less time it's going to take. And I like that effect just simply because it feels right for the theme of the quilt for me, but that's just me. One other idea I had was more straight line quilting and echo ditching, and to really leave the keys blank. So no quilting in the keys at all, but to quilt around them. As you can see, I did echo ditching around each space and kind of really broke it up into squares or rectangles. And that would be something you could mark, or you could use the edge of your walking foot or a ruler and ruler foot to guide. One idea also in the background, straight line quilting, and then bring those straight lines. Don't change the angle as you come around the bottom end of the quilt. Keep that straight and run straight lines all through that little pocket. And then down here, keep those straight lines running through that whole bottom edge too. Now that's going to be fairly slow. That would definitely be time consuming. You could travel stitch, so you could stitch, conceivably you could stitch off the edge of the quilt, backtrack, and kind of travel stitch back and forth, and that might be a little faster. You could also pull up thread with each line of quilting and just quilt off into the batting area, and it's going to be a little on the slow side. But I think that really is a cool effect, and it's adding a very gentle texture to that background, but I think if you used a slightly contrasting thread color, you are going to see it, you're going to feel it definitely, and that's going to accent the piecing. It's going to kind of puff out because it's not quilted down at all. So there we go. That is some suggestions for that Blue Keys quilt. And here we have a beautiful Valentine's Day quilt. This was posted by Luis Sanchez, and he said this is a table runner for St. Valentine and looking for ideas on how to quilt it. So super, super cute project here. My first idea was to do echo ditching around the heart. Now that could be with walking foot quilting, that could be with a ruler and ruler foot as a guide, just to go around it. Now I have found with heart shapes and things like this, when you do multiple rows of echoing, it can start to get weird. So the first line usually looks great, but it's whenever you get into the second line that, you start to, I don't know, as the shape gets smaller, the lobe of the heart gets longer, if that makes sense, and it starts to not look quite as nice. So maybe only 1 or 2 lines of echo quilting through there. And then I was thinking some straight lines in this border. Just straight lines straight out. It's a table runner, so you could go with as much or as little quilting as you like. You don't need tons to have a table runner be stable. But the more quilting you put into a project like this, the better it's going to wear. Obviously, a table runner, you're going to wash that a lot. And the more quilting you put into it, the less wrinkly it's going to come out of the wash. And the flatter it'll lay down on your table. So really kind of think about that when you're planning how much quilting you want to do. My next idea was to soften up the hearts. And that was to do a nice big curvy internal echo. And this would be done in free motion quilting, and then come around again, maybe 1 or 2 of those. Again, as you do internal echoes on a heart shape, it can start to go just a little bit on the weird side. And watch out for that. Many, many times I have quilted heart shapes and just been like, I wish I'd stopped. I wish I'd stopped at 1 or 2 echoes and just stop there. The tinier and tinier they get, the weirder they usually end up getting. So it's just food for thought, something I picked up on over the years. Now the border, again, go back to that heart paisley design. Let me flip over. I can really show you what that looks like. So you stitch a heart shape and swirl around it with an echo and swirl around it with an echo. It doesn't go weird if you're expanding the heart shape. It's when you're trying to shrink it down and go inside that it oftentimes ends up just looking a little bit on the strange side. So nice big heart paisley shapes. I think that would look really pretty in the border. And again, you could combine that. You could do heart paisley through a section of it. And then if you get bored, you're like, oh man, no more hearts, do straight line quilting right up to it. Who says you have to stitch the same border all the way around the quilt? I think that's a cool idea. You could quilt maybe 1/2 of the quilt with the heart paisley and the other half of the border with straight lines and have them meet up. I think that'll look really cool. As far as quilting something here in the background between the hearts, that would certainly make them stand out just a bit better. If you really want them to punch up, then pebbling is always a great choice. That really flattens everything out. If you're building skill for pebbling and it's still a struggle for you, use underwater rocks. It's basically circles, but it's messy circles. You go around and around and around, and it's intentionally messy. And that flattens it out even more. It's time consuming, but it's also fast because you're kind of intentionally being messy with it. So that one's a fun one too. And yeah, I used pebbling again for this one. So this was my third idea, was to fill the heart shape with pebbling. So go around and around, just fill in all that section with circles. And then if you wanted to, you could go and surround the whole thing with a big echo. So this is kind of taking that heart shape and saying, okay, this is the most important thing on the quilt. Make it nice and big and curvy. Go all the way around. And you can see I already did this one. You could kind of make them overlap a little bit. You might need to kind of stitch one and then you'll base the other ones off of that. So you'll stitch one and then the rest of them will kind of overlap and connect and you'll travel stitch along the edges of it. I think that works really well. But yeah, lots of pebbles. Will take more time, but it'll have a really cute pebbly texture. It'll be really nice. Now it's not going to stand out a super amount because that's, you know, pretty busy printed fabric. So you got to consider that, Louise, how much time you want to put into it when the quilting, the print is kind of still going to be the dominant thing on the quilt. And for that, I would probably recommend, you know, the simplest quilting design, just simply so that way the prints aren't competing with the quilting design. Always think about that. And you might even want to make another one out of solid fabrics so that way you can really play with the quilting and see what that's going to look like. And then you'll also have the print one when you're in the mood for prints and minimal quilting. So yeah, always think about that with your choices when you're pulling out fabrics to piece. Do you really want to have a major quilting adventure or do you want to have a major piecing adventure? Because the fabrics that you're using, you know, really do affect which one's going to stand out and shine the most. So thank you for sharing that with me, Louise. So now here is a quilt shared by Jamie Tufts, and this is her very first quilt top. So she said, I have just finished my very first quilt top. Thank you, Leah, for all of the instructions that made it easier along the way. I know I want to do some stitching in the ditch, especially around the cute fussy cut animals, but I'm rather at a loss after that. So this is a great first quilt. I did a 9 patch for my very first quilt too, Jamie, so I think this is super cute. So she already knows that she wants to do some stitching around these cute little animals. So that means that each of these spaces is going to be secured from the get-go. So really, you know, depending on your batting, you might need a lot of quilting around them. You might need only a little bit. So that's just something to keep in mind, that just going around and quilting each one of these is a good place to get started. And then as far as simplicity goes, I thought just, again, straight line quilting to go right through the middle of these squares. So the 9 patches. So I drew that and I just drew the single line first. Let me get it on here so you can really see it. That's not coming out very dark. Switch over back to my green. So I thought, okay, just one single straight line. I just wanted to see what that would look like. And I took a look and I thought, well, that's nice, but it doesn't really stand out all that well. So then I just added another line right next to it. So it's just 2 lines, and that would be 2 lines, maybe a 1/2 inch, could be 1 inch apart, could be 1/4 inch apart. Just you gotta play with it and decide what spacing you like best. And all of a sudden, just having 2 parallel lines running through there, I think that looks so nice. It's a frame around that cute little fussy cut animal. And it's also minimal quilting. It's not a ton of quilting. It's not really required for this quilt. You know, it's getting it enough quilting in there to get it secured so it can be used and enjoyed. And then down the road, if Jamie wants to go in and add more quilting, if she wants to do some stippling in here around each, you know, in each basically space that's left open, then she can. But honestly, this is plenty of quilting for this quilt. And I like that kind of framing effect that those double straight lines add. And I would carry that all the way through to the border, and then maybe run a double line down through the border too. So that's just my first idea. Yeah, again, I keep apologizing for the straight lines, guys, but it's just where my inspiration is running this month. It really is. Okay, so here we go. Next design was again playing off those fussy cut animals. That is the focal point of the quilt. And then to start a spiral and basically just spiral around it. It's basically like saying that is the most important thing in the quilt, and I'm going to go around and around it just to show it off. And I think that's super cute. Now, if you're on a home machine, quilting spirals like this with walking foot quilting is going to feel a little bit of a struggle because you're going to have to, kind of shove the whole quilt through your machine and continually change direction. Something like this will feel a lot easier if you do free motion quilting, but it probably won't feel as perfect. It won't look as perfect. So, be okay with it being a little on the wobbly side. I call this wobbly cosmos or stomach lining, and that can look really nice too. If it doesn't come out perfect, make it look intentional by making all of them a little bit wobbly. So one other idea was just some straight line quilting here in the sashing, and then also follow that up with some straight line quilting in the border. Maybe lines every 2 inches apart, something like that, 1 to 2 inches apart. And I think that would be plenty to finish it off, and it would quilt fairly quickly. It's going to be a little on the time consuming side to stitch all the way around all of those. You're going to have a thread break with each one, but I think that's a really good choice, especially when you take the time to do something like fussy cutting out every single one of those animals. Obviously, you want them to stand out nicely. So I think quilting around each one is going to be a great first choice. Okay, and now one more design idea, and this is really just, I don't know, adding some love. It is, Valentine's Day, so I thought this was kind of cute. And that was to go in with a nice heart shape in each corner. So fill that in, nice little heart shape. And you could travel stitch. What you could do is quilt the heart, travel stitch, quilt that heart, and you're stitching in the ditch. So that would mean not only is your little animal stitched, you could also stitch around that. So you've got both of them filled. I thought that looked kind of nice. So it would be heart shape, stitch in the ditch, heart shape, stitch in the ditch, all the way around. And that would be fairly easy in free motion quilting. And then for your sashing, you could kind of do this angular hearts, something like that. Almost a feather. A feather would be kind of a cool idea too. That would be sweet. And for the borders, you could do, like a big heart shape, that same heart paisley. I keep to, like I said, sometimes inspiration just won't let go, and that heart paisley border is what's coming to mind a lot. Maybe I need to go quilt that. I think I need to go quilt that because it's Valentine's Day and I'm thinking hearts and that nice paisley design. That's one of my favorites. So yeah, I think that would be really cute. That would step it up a notch on the heart angle. It would definitely accent the kind of cutesy kind of theme you've got going on. It's going to take a little bit more time because this is section quilting. This is paying attention to each individual section of the quilt and quilting something separate in each section. However, when it's a special quilt, that's absolutely worth taking the extra time. So good luck, Jamie, with your very first quilt. I can't wait to see a picture of it whenever you get it quilted. And here is our last quilt posted by Kathy G. And this is a string quilt, and it's actually blocks. It's not put together yet, so this is kind of just going off of that string quilt look and what I think is a really good quilting design. And the first thing to say is just there's not going to be a lot that's going to be really visible on this quilt because there's so many different colors, there's so many different piecing lines. It's just not, the quilting design's not the focal point here. So my first idea was just to run straight lines through this white sashing area. And that's going to be minimal quilting. It's going to get the job done so the quilt can be used and enjoyed. It is accenting the piecing in the sense of, it's accenting how you put those blocks together and running right through the middle of that white section. I think it's going to look nice. You could also kind of turn it into that frame design idea by just running a second line parallel to the first. So 1/4 inch away, 1/2 inch away, either one is a good choice. It just adds that little bit of echo quilting that steps it up a notch, and that makes it almost look like a frame and makes those string blocks really stand out nicely. And it all depends on the rating of your batting. How much space can you leave open without the batting in the middle of the quilt potentially shifting? And if your rating is not quite big enough, then just simply stitch in the ditch through the middle of your blocks. And then that would be as much quilting as you're going to need. Okay, so now another idea, and this would be really just saying, okay, enough straight lines. Let's soften up all those straight lines. And that would be to quilt something like basic spiral. And so this is just a really nice open spiral design. It's a similar design family to stippling, meaning you're not going to do any travel stitching. You're just going to go all over the surface with these beautiful spiral shapes. And when you're quilting on a home machine, here is your path. You're going to start in the center and quilt that design over to the edge, and then stitch along that edge and go down, and then keep quilting that spiral design back into the center, and then quilt down to the next bottom edge. And as you're going, you're rotating the quilt around. So now this is what's in the arm of your machine, and then you can quilt that spiral back into the center. And what this does is it breaks your quilt up into quadrants. You can run a Google search on quadrant quilting. I've done a couple videos on this, just explaining how it works. You take that spiral and stitch it down this way, and basically just leaves pockets of the quilt open that are a lot more manageable to quilt on your home machine. So now I was over here, keep quilting that basic spiral design all the way up to this edge. And of course, you don't want to kind of do the exact same spiral, always turning in the same direction. You want to kind of wiggle it around this way and then wiggle it around that way and make one bigger and make one smaller. And that makes it a lot more interesting. There we go. And then you've got your tail end. You can always match up with where you started, and then you have no thread tail, well, you have no obvious thread breaks on the surface. And then from here, all you need to do is pull up thread and quilt those quadrants. And I promise you, this is so much easier on a home machine because you only have that quarter of the quilt in your machine at any given time. So I would have it on the machine like this. My machine would be here, quilt it over, and then quilt back into the center. And then once you get in the center, then you're quilting over to the right. So there's less and less bulk in the arm of your machine. It really does work well. So that would be my suggestion for quilting all over style with basic spiral. And then last design idea is another spiral design, same concept of quadrant quilting, but I call this swirling water. It's one of my favorites. So nice big spiral shape, return to your starting point, and then you're going to go up and hit the tip of that spiral and swing around it. And that just makes the entire design expand. Swing around. And so with this, you're going to have travel stitching that's going to slow you down just a little bit, but you're going to have a much nicer punch of texture. Here, let me draw you that design. So nice big spiral shape, return to your starting point, then swing around again, hit that tip, come back down, and you can keep going as many times around that shape as you need to. When you're ready to branch off in another direction, either travel stitch along the back of the design or travel stitch along the front of the design and then swirl off with another shape. Remember, all quilting designs are based on a simple set of rules. Once you memorize those rules, you can quilt that design anywhere. Think of this like signing your name in cursive. You don't think about that anymore. It's something that happens so naturally and fluidly, you don't even have to think about it. And that's how it works with all of these filler designs too. So there we go. That is 3 different ideas for a string quilt. So thank you guys so much for sharing all of these beautiful quilts with me. I absolutely love going through them. And I hope that you can see that at any given time, your inspiration is going to change. You're going to have days where all you can think about is spirals. You're going to have days where all you can think about is straight lines. And if you're still feeling unsatisfied with your quilting design, hang your quilt up somewhere where you can see it all the time, especially when you're eating meals. I usually use my dining room table wall and I hang it up and I just sit as I'm eating a meal and I just stare at the quilt. And it might not happen immediately, but after 1 or 2 weeks, I usually can see something else in that design or I can see where that quilting needs to go and what I want it to accent. So if you don't like these suggestions, or you're just still feeling like it's not quite the right thing that you're just really in love with, then live with the quilt in your space and keep thinking about it and keep letting your brain munch on it a little bit. And I promise you, eventually you're going to see that quilting design through the piecing, where you want it to go, where you want it to accent. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. Make sure to share more photos with me, one per person, please. And I will share suggestions every month on how you quilt your quilts.